Welcome back to Dungeon Brew, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about sword and sorcery when it comes to building your campaign or building your world. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
So we've already talked about a number of different genres here on Dungeon Brew, where we've gone through the dark fantasy gamut. We've talked about heroic and anti-heroic fantasy. And today we're going to be talking about sword and sorcery, which is a little bit away from anything else that we've dealt with so far. Joshua, can you provide a little bit of groundwork as we get into this one?
Yeah, sword and sorcery are two words that are thrown around a lot in the fantasy genre. I think people talk about it a lot without necessarily giving definition to it. When I think of sword and sorcery fantasy, I'm talking about or thinking about adventure fantasy. Mm-hmm. These are stories that primarily are talking about the escapades of your hero or anti-hero. Either one can exist within this world. And them going out and essentially delving into the dungeon, overcoming some sort of task, engaging in personal battles with enemies to become bigger and stronger and badder than they were before, to get into the next dungeon or to continue on their adventure. They're not necessarily looking at anything that's impacting the entire world. They're not necessarily trying to go and change things or make things in a certain way. It's almost like your hack and slash fantasy, which I know a lot of players enjoy that type of gameplay. Mm-hmm. But this for me it's all about the adventure. We can probably give lots of examples for this, but it's adventure-based fantasy. It's about the fun of the game.
Right. This is very popular 70s and 80s D&D modules. I mean, you can pick up almost any of them, and that's what sword and sorcery is. A lot of Conan is sword and sorcery. And even when you get into some high fantasy settings like Forgotten Realms and especially Dragonlance, there are usually a lot of like one-off or short series books in Dragonlance that are very much sword and sorcery. They have little like quintets or sextets or trilogies or whatever, and they just deal with the sword and like this kind of this kind of adventure that involves one or two or more characters, and you follow their adventures through the course of the novel, and that's it. They're usually one-off novels because it's about the adventure, and once the adventure is over, then the story is over. Oftentimes in D&D, this translates to a series of adventures, and they can or may not be connected. It's not terribly important. It's just whether or not the GM decides that they want to have a thread that connects everything together. Or it might be a situation where it's like you have small arcs where it's like we have several adventures in a row that are connected, and then we take a rest between the next big adventure, and there's another call to action, and then they go on another series of quests, and then there's another call to action. Like you said, it's not generally something that is world ending, which is usually something that involves starting at level 1 or a low level and then following this long arc that eventually gets you to the conclusion where you save the world from whatever is going on. That really doesn't fit with sword and sorcery either.
Yeah, it's not a grand epic tale. Like I love the example of Conan because I own tons of Conan books. I own ones that were written by Howard. I own ones that were written by Jordan. And I love the characters so much that I continuously dive into another book to read about an entirely new adventure, which may or may not have anything to do with any adventures that were ever done before. Right. In fact, those adventures may never be referenced or even talked about. But I love the characters so much I want to keep playing them and putting them into another scenario. So in Sword and Sorcery, your players may have their favorite character. Like for me, I would love to go back 15 years and grab my beguiler and bring him into a modern day adventure just to play the character again because I loved the character and I want to see him engage in a different scenario with different challenges and see how he might handle that. And that's what's fun about it. There's again, lots of examples of where you may see this in literary works too. The Odyssey for me is a big sword and sorcery adventure. And then the thing with that is that doesn't mean there's not epic aspects. That doesn't mean there's not like a plot thread or an individual challenge or even moral quandaries that are there. But it has encounters that are really focused on a sword and sorcery like engagement. And the reason I'm pointing that out is because in previous videos we've talked about character development and shaping your character to make them kind of fit into the world. When you're building a sword and sorcery campaign, you're building encounters and an exotic type of experience for the characters to live through more than the characters are focusing on the type of character they're building. And the Odyssey for me is like that exotic experience that you're building for your characters, where they're going from one crazy ass event to another crazy ass event that is almost more exciting than the last.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really important aspect. In terms of many of the other types of fantasy that we've talked about so far, there usually is some focus on the characters. There's a focus on their development and their growth, and them coming to terms with things, moral quandaries that they have to face. There's a ton of that gets focused on in other types of fantasy. Sword and sorcery, not so much. It is, you have a character that has a personality, and that personality exists almost in perpetuity. There's usually not a whole lot of development or change. It is about the adventure and then butting up that character against the adventure and seeing what happens, or the exotic location or whatever, and just seeing how they handle it. Like you said, with the Conan books, there's a bunch of adventures, and Conan is kind of this stagnant figure that comes into each adventure, and he does all of these adventure-y things, and then the next book starts, and it's like he's back and he's started over, and what happened in the previous adventure doesn't really have much to do with what's going on in the next one, and he just goes on to the next adventure, and so on and so forth, all the way through. And that really is the essence of what sword and sorcery is. There aren't moral quandaries that exist in this, and morality is kind of irrelevant. You don't pose moral quandaries because the moral quandaries are not important to the story, versus darker fantasy or anti-heroic fantasy, where you have this amorality that exists, or this sense of what is right and what is wrong, and then you make the characters try and decide what it is that they should do. In this scenario, if you have a character moving through an adventure, who they should kill is pretty much everyone, and who they should not kill is probably just somebody who is obviously not an enemy. Like, there's not really a barrier there. They just kind of go in and goes, oh, that very attractive, person who is chained up in the cell, that's obviously another hero who should come along with me on my adventure. All of these other things are enemies and monsters, and they all need to die.
Yeah, I oftentimes look back to old works like you're talking about if I want to build this type of world for my players, because I think that things like old sagas and fables, even some early 1990s television like Xena, like kind of fits into this. It's become more common, I think, in modern media and art to have ongoing long stories that all have these threads that tie it together, where we get driven into like this epic plot that's being presented to us. But things, when I look back, again, like the Norse sagas and stuff like that, it's very short, like little experiences with lessons attached to them that characters are going through and experiencing, without a lot of depth and a lot of weight on their shoulders for what that experience is. So if you're looking for inspiration, I would say go back further into some of the resources that you have for inspiration.
Yeah, and like I said, 70s and 80s style D&D adventures are very much sword and sorcery. If you are looking for inspiration on what those adventures look like, that's a really good place to start as well. Think of the old Funhouse style dungeons like White Plume Mountain. Those are really good examples. Generally speaking, in sword and sorcery, there's a tendency that the big bad is usually some kind of sorcerer, wizard, or necromancer, or something that falls into that realm. And you have to battle through their tower or their dungeon in order to be able to defeat them, which means that you're also going through the series of obstacles that they've put in place in order to try and defeat would-be adventurers who come against them, because that's what you do when you're in a villain in this, is that you create obstacles for heroes or for adventurers who want to come through and kick down your door. So you end up with weird stuff. So I can't remember which Conan movie it is, but there's one where it's like he goes into a tower and there's all the mirrors. And this is honestly a trope that I see everywhere in D&D. You always, if you're doing a funhouse dungeon, there's almost always a room full of mirrors where either there is you are going to step out and kill yourself or fight yourself in that room, or there's something waiting on the other side of the mirror, or something along those lines. But it's a very common expression of how sword and sorcery works. This funhouse dungeon that I built for my players at one point is they walked in the first room of the dungeon is they walked into a room that was an invisible maze because it was filled with force barriers, and they couldn't see where the walls were because force magic, force walls are invisible. And so they basically just had to walk until they hit a wall and then try and turn left or right. But they had no way of mapping which direction that they were going while they were traveling through this. And it was the first way of trying to pass through this dungeon or this wizard's tower was getting through an invisible maze while they were being attacked by enemies within it.
And I'm glad that you're pointing out that example, because really this is where the challenge comes from, I think, in creating this type of world, is the DM has to be somewhat creative.
Yeah.
It doesn't always have to have bizarro aspects. When I think of sword and sorcery, I think of some bizarro stuff too. Maybe not to the Lovecraftian level.
Right, no, nothing weird.
Yeah, nothing super weird, but it is a little bit of a bizarro element where you're having to introduce new challenges for the character, because the challenge for them is not like this internal turmoil they're dealing with. It's them versus oftentimes the external world, the environment, the monsters that they're facing. And sometimes there's a unique way to overcome that challenge that they have to discover.
Yeah, and oftentimes it also is a situation where it's like it allows for player creativity. That's a lot of the fun of these styles of games, is that you go in and, the invisible maze situation, it's like they could come up with any number of ways in order to try and resolve that. Whether that's just like using some kind of like ink in their pack in order to draw on the walls to see where the walls exist to try and map themselves through it, using magic spells of some kind to be able to teleport. There's not really any limitation there. A lot of what this game style is presenting a bizarro puzzle in front of your players, not having a defined solution and allowing them to be creative in the way that they solve it. You start to fail when you have situations where a lot of the puzzles have predefined solutions and you're always expecting that perfect response in order to get your players through it, because it stifles that creativity, it stifles that chance for adventure. I'm not saying you can't have that sometimes, but I'm saying that if it's solely that, then it becomes tedious, because then your players are not able to enjoy the adventure that they're experiencing.
So my last thought on this topic, in agreement with everything that you're saying, is you're going to notice that in this video and in the previous video, we didn't spend a lot of time talking about geography, political stuff, magic, high or low, religion, the cosmos, like some of these other world building aspects. And for me, it's because in both heroic fantasy and in sword and sorcery, these are even anti-heroic. These are kind of like on a sliding scale a lot of the time for many of those, where you can kind of pick and choose what you'd like to include and how much of it you'd like to include within the world that you've built. The focus in running these games is different than what some of the other ones are that we're going to be talking about. The focus on this one is primarily, I think, again, being creative as a dungeon master and creating that exotic experience for your players.
And we are going to do a couple of videos on like low magic, low fantasy, high magic, high fantasy, and generally speaking, those are ones that you can apply as kind of modifiers to heroic, anti-heroic, and sword and sorcery especially. Especially when it comes to things like the level of magic or the level of fantasy in those worlds. Sword and sorcery is one that it's like when you have low magic, it's generally the case, which this could exist with high magic as well, but as sorcerers and wizards are almost always evil. They're kind of this dark force that exists in the world because they manipulate reality. It's just whether or not the wizard in a low magic system is able to cast fireball, and that's terrifying, or it's a high magic system where he's casting time stop and all this other nonsense. So you just kind of have to play with where you want those lines drawn in this type of environment to make sure that it makes sense for your game.
Yeah, and as you said previously in another video, is that a lot of these that we're offering to you as different genres separate of each other is really going to be a mix and match.
Yeah.
You're going to be able to watch through this series and be like, man, I'm going to run me an anti-heroic sword and sorcery epic fantasy. Like You're going to find a collection of them and then take elements of each one of those and include it to make a full game that your players are going to be able to enjoy.
Yeah, and it's what you and I do all the time. I have a preference for the dark fantasy spectrum there, but I run grimdark, and I'll throw Lovecraftian horror elements in there. I almost always include a couple of funhouse dungeons in the sword and sorcery style, just so that you can kind of kick back and explore a dungeon and deal with strange stuff, and then try and defeat it. I enjoy that type of stuff. I enjoy mixing and matching because I have even though I thematically will create a game that exists within one kind of core element, I have a tendency to kind of breach out and go, okay, this session or this arc is going to be Lovecraftian, this arc is going to be sword and sorcery, and allow the players to experience things so it doesn't become too monotonous as you're going through and doing a campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, again, thank you all for hanging out with John and I. We hope that you enjoy this video and the future ones to come. Hit the subscribe button, and we'll talk to you next time.
Dungeon Brew.